Greyhaven was the kind of city people trusted without thinking about it. It sat quietly between a river and a stretch of low hills, neither too large nor too small, just big enough to feel alive and just small enough for secrets to travel slowly. Mornings began with the sound of delivery trucks and the smell of coffee drifting from corner cafes. Children walked to school without fear. Shop owners left their doors unlocked for a few minutes at a time, and police sirens were rare enough to turn heads when they did pass. That calm ended on a rainy Tuesday night. Daniel Cross stayed late in his downtown office, as he often did. He was a respected criminal defense lawyer, known for his sharp mind and calm voice in the courtroom. To some, he was a protector of rights. To others, he was a man who helped criminals escape consequences. That night, the lights in his office burned long after the rest of the building went dark. Paperwork was stacked neatly on his desk, and his coat hung untouched on the back of his chair. When the cleaning staff arrived just before midnight, they found the door unlocked. Daniel Cross was slumped in his chair, head tilted slightly forward as if he had fallen asleep. It took several seconds for the cleaner to realize what was wrong. There was no blood splattered across the room, no overturned furniture, no signs of panic. Just a single gunshot wound to the chest, precise and fatal. Behind him, drawn carefully on the pale wall, was a symbol painted in black ink. It was a scale, balanced perfectly, each side equal. Police flooded the building within minutes. The quiet streets outside filled with flashing lights that reflected off wet pavement. Officers searched every corner, every stairwell, every exit. There was no weapon, no fingerprints. Security cameras showed nothing unusual. Whoever had done this had planned it carefully and left without being seen. By morning, the news had spread across Greyhaven. Daniel Cross was dead, murdered in his own office. The symbol on the wall was blurred on television screens, but its meaning was obvious. Justice, balance, judgment. Public reaction was immediate and divided. Some mourned Cross as a man who believed deeply in the law. Others were less sympathetic. Radio shows and online forums filled with angry voices accusing him of helping dangerous people walk free. Old cases were dragged back into the spotlight, replayed and argued over as if the trial had never ended. While the city argued, a man named Elias Ward sat alone in a small apartment on the edge of Greyhaven. His building was old, with cracked paint and narrow hallways that smelled faintly of dust and damp wood. Elias lived on the third floor, in a unit that looked almost empty despite being fully furnished. Everything he owned had a purpose. Nothing was decorative. The television glowed softly in the dark room as the news replayed footage from the crime scene. Elias sat perfectly still in a wooden chair, hands resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the screen. His face showed no shock, no fear, no sadness, only quiet focus. Elias was 46 years old. He had once been a social studies teacher at a local high school. Former students remembered him as calm and serious, the kind of teacher who spoke slowly and expected everyone to listen. He loved history, especially the parts about laws, revolutions, and justice systems. He believed rules existed to protect the innocent and punish the guilty. But Elias had left teaching years ago. After his resignation, he faded from public view. He worked short-term jobs, none of them lasting long. He avoided friendships. He stopped speaking to his family. Over time, his world became smaller, shrinking to his apartment, the public library, and the quiet paths he walked late at night. What few people knew was that Elias spent most of his time studying court records. He read trial transcripts, appeals, and legal decisions with intense concentration. He filled notebooks with handwritten notes, highlighting patterns he believed others ignored. Names of victims, names of defendants, outcomes of cases. He followed the law not with admiration, but with growing disappointment. As the news anchor described Daniel Cross's career, Elias leaned forward slightly. His lips curved into a faint smile, one that disappeared almost as soon as it appeared. To him, this was not chaos. It was correction. Years earlier, Elias had watched his younger sister testify in court. She had been the victim in a violent crime, her voice shaking as she told the truth. The man accused was defended by Daniel Cross. Through sharp arguments and legal technicalities, Cross had dismantled her testimony piece by piece. The jury returned a verdict of not guilty. Elias remembered the look on his sister's face as the decision was read. It was not anger. It was disbelief. Weeks later, she stopped leaving her house. Months later, she stopped speaking at all. She died 2 years after the trial. Her death ruled an accident, though Elias never believed that word explained anything. From that moment on, something inside Elias broke quietly and completely. He had trusted the system. He had believed justice was slow but fair. When the system failed his sister, he tried to accept it. But then he saw it happen again, and again, and again. Guilty people walking free. Victims forgotten. Judges citing procedure while families mourned. Elias came to a simple conclusion. If the law could not deliver justice, then justice needed help. On the coffee table in front of him lay a black notebook. Its pages were thick and worn, filled with careful handwriting. On the first page was a quote written in neat letters. Justice delayed is justice denied. Below it were dozens of names. Some crossed out. Some circled. Each represented a person Elias believed had escaped true judgment. Daniel Cross's name was now crossed out. As the news shifted to interviews with shocked co-workers and legal experts, Elias turned off the television. Silence filled the room. He stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the city lights flickering in the distance. Greyhaven looked peaceful from above, unaware of what had begun. Elias did not see himself as a killer. In his mind, he was a witness correcting errors. Every action he took was measured, planned, and justified. He believed emotion clouded judgment, so he removed emotion from his decisions. There was no anger in him now, only purpose. He returned to the table and opened the notebook to a new page. At the top, he drew a small, perfect scale. Under it, he wrote a single word, balance. Outside, rain continued to fall, washing the streets clean. Inside, Elias prepared for what came next. He knew the city would call the murder evil. He knew police would hunt him. None of that mattered. What mattered was that someone had finally acted when the system refused to. As Greyhaven slept, unaware of the storm forming beneath its calm surface, a quiet man with loud beliefs took his first step toward becoming something the city would never forget. The days following Daniel Cross's murder felt heavier than usual in Greyhaven. People still went to work, cafes still opened their doors, and traffic still crawled through downtown streets, but something invisible had changed. Conversations lowered when the case was mentioned. Neighbors double-checked locks. Parents kept their children closer. The idea that someone could enter a locked office, kill a man so cleanly, and vanish without a trace unsettled even those who believed the city was safe. Police held press conferences, promising swift justice, but there was little they could share. No weapon had been recovered. No witnesses had come forward. The strange symbol on the wall became the most talked about detail. Experts argued over its meaning. Some called it a message. Others dismissed it as theatrics meant to confuse investigators. 2 weeks later, the city was shaken again. Robert Hale, a construction company owner, was found dead in his luxury home just outside Greyhaven. He was discovered in his study, seated upright, hands folded neatly on his lap. Like Daniel Cross, he had been killed with a single gunshot. And once again, the same black scale symbol was drawn on the wall behind him. Panic spread quickly. Robert Hale had been accused years earlier of exploiting undocumented workers, underpaying them and forcing them to work in dangerous conditions. Several workers had testified against him, but the case collapsed when key evidence was ruled inadmissible. Hale walked free, wealth intact, reputation bruised but unharmed. The similarities were impossible to ignore. 2 men. 2 clean killings. 2 identical symbols. This time, the media response was louder and more aggressive. Headlines screamed about a serial killer. Talk shows debated whether the murderer was sending a message. Online forums exploded with opinions, many of them disturbing. Some commenters openly celebrated Hale's death, calling it karma. Others warned that anyone could be next. Detective Mara Klein joined the investigation after the second killing. She was known for her attention to detail and her refusal to accept easy answers. From the beginning, something about the case bothered her. The killings were too controlled, too intentional. This wasn't rage or revenge in the usual sense. It felt deliberate, almost ceremonial. Mara spent hours reviewing both crime scenes. She noticed how similar they were, not just in method but in atmosphere. No mess. No chaos. It was as if the killer wanted to show respect, or at least order. That detail stayed with her. Before she could fully process the second murder, a third one followed. Judge Alan Mercer was found dead in his vacation cabin by the lake. Like the others, he had been shot once, cleanly and precisely. The scale symbol appeared again, this time carved into a wooden wall with careful lines. The city crossed a line from fear into obsession. Judge Mercer had a controversial past. He was suspected of accepting bribes in exchange for lighter sentences, but internal investigations never produced enough proof. Officially, he retired with honor. Unofficially, many believed he had sold justice to the highest bidder. Now, 3 people were dead, each tied to the legal system, each believed by some to have escaped punishment. The media gave the killer a name that stuck almost instantly, the Justice Killer. Mara hated the name. It gave the murderer too much power, too much meaning. But she couldn't deny that the pattern was clear. This killer was choosing targets carefully. And more importantly, he was choosing them based on a personal definition of guilt. As public pressure grew, the police department worked around the clock. Task forces were formed. Profiles were written. Psychologists suggested the killer suffered from delusions of moral superiority. Others argued he believed he was fixing something broken. Mara focused on facts. She started reviewing the court histories of all 3 victims, not just the cases everyone already talked about, but every trial, every appeal, every witness statement. That was when she noticed something others had missed. In each major case tied to the victims, there had been at least one witness whose testimony was ignored, discredited, or legally blocked. These witnesses weren't unreliable. They were inconvenient. Mara felt a chill as she realized what that meant. The killer wasn't just punishing people who got away with crimes. He was acting on behalf of the forgotten voices, the ones the system had quietly pushed aside. While the city searched for him, Elias Ward moved through his days with careful routine. He followed the news closely, noting which details were shared and which were kept quiet. He listened to commentators argue about whether the Justice Killer was evil or necessary. He paid attention to how language shaped opinion. At the public library, Elias sat at the same table every afternoon, surrounded by stacks of legal books. To anyone watching, he looked like a researcher or a bored academic. No one noticed the way his eyes hardened when he read certain names. No one noticed how he copied passages into his notebook with steady precision. Elias believed patterns revealed truth. And in his mind, the pattern was undeniable. The law claimed to be blind, but Elias saw clearly who it favored. Wealth, power, influence. The victims he chose were not innocent men misunderstood by society. They were symbols of a system that pretended fairness while protecting itself. At home, Elias kept his notebook locked inside a drawer. Inside it were pages filled with case summaries written in his own words, stripped of emotional language. Each concluded with a simple judgment. Guilty. Unanswered. Corrected. Robert Hale and Judge Mercer's names were now crossed out. Despite his confidence, Elias felt something new growing beneath the surface. Attention. The more the media talked, the more people debated, the harder it became to remain invisible. He had expected fear. He had not expected admiration. Strangers online praised the killer for doing what courts would not. They spoke about justice as if it was simple, as if death balanced scales neatly. Elias read these comments late at night, his expression unreadable. They didn't understand. This was not about anger or revenge. It was about responsibility. Meanwhile, Detective Mara Klein felt the case closing in around her. She knew the killer was educated, disciplined, and patient. He wasn't rushing. He was waiting. Then she found something that confirmed her instincts. A junior officer flagged an old, almost forgotten file connected to Judge Mercer. It involved a wrongful conviction from over a decade ago. A man had been sentenced based on evidence later questioned, but the appeal failed. The judge overseeing that appeal was Mercer. The conviction stood. The man died in prison 5 years later. Mara stayed at the file, her stomach tightening. The victim's name was underlined in red ink in the margin, written by an unknown hand. Someone had accessed the file recently. For the first time, Mara felt certain of one thing. The Justice Killer wasn't finished. As Greyhaven struggled to understand what was happening within its borders, the truth remained hidden in plain sight. A man driven by belief was rewriting the meaning of justice one death at a time, while those sworn to uphold the law raced to catch up. And still, no one saw the full pattern. Not yet. By the time the fourth killing happened, Greyhaven no longer felt like a city reacting to Faye. It felt like a city waiting for judgment. People scanned faces in grocery stores, lowered their voices in court buildings, and read the news with a mix of dread and curiosity. The Justice Killer had become more than a criminal. He had become a presence, a shadow that seemed to hover over every unresolved wrong. The fourth victim did not fit what the public expected. Linda Hayes was found dead in a modest suburban home just after dawn. She lay on the living room floor, one hand resting against her chest as if she had reached there in surprise. There was no forced entry, no signs of struggle. A single gunshot wound ended her life instantly. The familiar scale symbol was there again, drawn neatly on the wall above a framed family photograph. Linda Hayes was not rich. She was not famous. She was not powerful. She was a former police officer. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Supporters of the Justice Killer fell silent, unsure how to explain this choice. Critics seized on it as proof that the killer was nothing more than a murderer hiding behind symbols. News channels replayed Linda's career highlights. Interviews with former colleagues painted her as strict but dedicated, a woman who believed deeply in order and rules. But there was another side to Linda Hayes, one buried under years of paperwork and sealed files. Detective Mara Klein arrived at the crime scene before the media could swarm the neighborhood. As she stood in the quiet living room, the smell of cleaning products still lingering in the air, she felt something tighten in her chest. This murder was different. Not in method, but in meaning. Linda Hayes had resigned from the police force 8 years earlier after being accused of planting evidence in a high-profile case. The charges against her were eventually dropped due to lack of proof. Officially, she left under a cloud of suspicion but without consequences. Unofficially, many believed she had crossed a line and been protected by the system. Mara remembered the case. A teenage boy named Aaron Cole had died in custody after being arrested on robbery charges. Evidence collected by Linda Hayes had been key to building the case. Later, questions arose about how that evidence appeared at the scene. The investigation into Linda went nowhere. The department closed ranks. The case faded from public memory. But the boy's family never forgot. As Mara studied the crime scene, she realized something unsettling. The Justice Killer's choices were evolving. This was no longer about lawyers and judges alone. It was about anyone who, in his mind, had twisted justice, regardless of their position. Back at the station, tension filled every hallway. Officers argued quietly. Some were angry. Some were scared. A few looked inward, wondering what decisions from their own past might look like under the killer's judgment. Mara locked herself in her office with the files connected to Linda Hayes. She reread witness statements, internal reports, and disciplinary notes. One detail stood out. During the original investigation, a young detective had raised concerns about the evidence Linda submitted. That detective's report was never followed up on. The matter had been quietly closed. Mara leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. The pattern was no longer abstract. It was deeply personal to the system she served. While the city reeled, Elias Ward sat alone at his kitchen table, staring at Linda Hayes' name written in his notebook. His hand hovered over the page, pen unmoving. This time, crossing out the name did not bring relief. Linda's case had haunted him for years. He had followed it closely, not because it involved his sister, but because it showed how easily truth could be buried. A boy was dead. A family was broken. And the people responsible continued their lives untouched. Elias told himself this killing was necessary. That justice demanded consistency. That positions and titles could not protect someone from judgment. Yet something inside him resisted. Unlike his other targets, Linda Hayes had not lived comfortably. She had lost her job, her reputation, and most of her friends. Her life after the police force had been quiet and small. Elias had studied her closely before deciding. He had convinced himself that consequences alone were not justice. Accountability mattered more. Still, as he listened to the news coverage, Elias felt the first true crack in his certainty. The world was no longer reacting the way he expected. Instead of debating the failures of the system, people were arguing about him, about his motives, about his sanity. He had never wanted attention. Elias turned off the television and opened a different notebook, one he rarely used. Inside were clippings and handwritten notes about Detective Mara Klein. At first, he had only noticed her name during press conferences. She spoke carefully, avoided dramatic language, and refused to give the killer a title. She talked about victims, not messages. That bothered him. Curiosity turned into research. Years earlier, Mara had been involved in a case that ended with an innocent man sent to prison. The conviction was legal, supported by evidence accepted at the time. Later, new information surfaced, suggesting the evidence was misleading. The appeal process dragged on for years. The man died in prison before the truth fully emerged. To Elias, the details were clear. Intent did not erase outcome. A life was lost because of a failure to question the system. Mara Klein's name was added to his list. At the police department, Mara began to feel the pressure in unexpected ways. Anonymous emails arrived in her inbox, quoting legal phrases about balance and responsibility. A letter was slipped under her apartment door, containing nothing but a hand-drawn scale. She did not tell anyone. Instead, she worked longer hours. She reviewed her old cases, searching for patterns, for blind spots she had never noticed before. The deeper she looked, the more uncomfortable she became. She saw moments where she had trusted procedure over doubt. Moments where moving forward felt easier than stopping to question. The justice killer was forcing her to confront truths she had buried. One night, alone in her office, Mara opened the file of the man who died in prison. She read his letters from behind bars, each one insisting on his innocence, each one growing weaker over time. Her hands shook as she closed the file. For the first time, she wondered if the killer was right about one thing. The system did fail people. But she knew something else just as clearly. Murder was not justice. As days passed without another killing, the city held its breath. Some hoped the killer had stopped. Others feared he was choosing his next target carefully. Elias felt trapped between belief and doubt. He replayed his actions in his mind, searching for certainty. The law had failed his sister. It had failed Aaron Cole. It had failed countless others. But now, standing at the edge of another decision, the clarity he once felt was gone. Late one night, Elias stood at his window, watching police lights flash in the distance. He imagined Detective Mara Klein at her desk, studying him without knowing his face. He imagined her wrestling with guilt, just as he had wrestled with grief. He did not feel hatred toward her. That realization terrified him. Justice, as he had defined it, was no longer clean. It was tangled with emotion, doubt, and something dangerously close to empathy. Elias feared that if he allowed that feeling to grow, his purpose would collapse. Across the city, Mara stared at the scale symbol drawn in her notebook, copied from crime scene photos. She realized the killer was not just judging individuals. He was challenging the idea of justice itself. And now, the challenge had become personal. Both hunter and hunted stood at a turning point, each forced to confront the same question from opposite sides. When the system fails, who has the right to decide what justice looks like? Neither of them yet understood how devastating the answer would be. Greyhaven woke each morning with a careful kind of fear. It was no longer sharp panic or loud outrage, but a quiet tension that settled into routines. People checked the news before leaving their homes. Office workers paused when they saw unfamiliar faces. Police officers felt the weight of their badges more heavily than before. The justice killer had not struck again after Linda Hayes, and the silence itself became disturbing. Detective Mara Klein felt that silence press against her every hour of the day. She noticed it first in small ways. A black sedan parked across the street from her apartment that seemed to be there too often. A man in the courthouse hallway who looked at her a second longer than necessary. An envelope slipped under her door with no return address, containing a single sentence written in careful ink. Justice sees all sides. Mara did not report the message. She did not tell her partner. Instead, she folded the paper and placed it inside her desk drawer, as if keeping it close might give her control over it. She knew, without needing proof, that she had crossed an invisible line. The killer was no longer just an idea chasing her through files and evidence. He was watching her. At the station, the atmosphere had changed. Officers spoke less freely. Some avoided eye contact with Mara, unsure whether to see her as a colleague or potential target. Others quietly supported her, leaving coffee on her desk or offering to walk her to her car. Everyone understood what was happening, even if no one said it out loud. Mara spent her nights reviewing old cases, especially her own. She read transcripts with new eyes, catching moments where she had trusted the system without question. Procedures followed correctly. Evidence logged properly. Verdicts reached legally. And yet, lives destroyed. The case that haunted her most was the one Elias Ward had chosen as his reason to judge her, though she did not yet know his name. A man named Thomas Reed, convicted of armed robbery based largely on eyewitness testimony and circumstantial evidence. The court accepted it. The appeals failed. Years later, new evidence suggested the eyewitness had been mistaken. By the time the case reopened, Thomas Reed was already dead. Mara had testified honestly. She had not lied. But she had not questioned deeply enough either. The justice killer had found the cracks. While Mara wrestled with guilt, Elias Ward felt his carefully built certainty begin to crumble. He had always believed distance was necessary. Distance from emotion. Distance from doubt. That was how justice could remain pure. But now, the distance was gone. He followed Mara's movements closely, not out of hatred, but out of need. He needed her to fit the pattern he had built in his mind. Guilty. Unrepentant. Protected. Yet every article he read described her pushing for internal reviews, reopening old files, and publicly admitting mistakes. This was not how his story was supposed to unfold. Elias had sent the message to her door without fully thinking it through. When he realized what he had done, panic flickered briefly through him. He had broken one of his own rules. He had stepped into the light. The city's attention began to shift. Reporters started speculating that the justice killer might be closing in on law enforcement itself. Rumors spread that a major figure would be next. Every press conference felt heavier, more guarded. Then Mara made a decision that stunned everyone. She called a press conference of her own. Standing before a row of microphones, eyes tired but steady, she spoke about accountability. She spoke about mistakes made in the past, including her own. She announced the reopening of several cases tied to wrongful convictions and promised full transparency, even if it damaged careers or reputations. The room fell silent as she finished speaking. Some officers felt betrayed. Others felt relief. The public reaction was split. Many praised her courage. Others accused her of acting out of fear, trying to save herself from the justice killer's judgment. Elias watched the broadcast from his apartment, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. He replayed her words again and again. She was doing something none of his other targets had done. She was accepting responsibility. This created a dangerous conflict in his mind. If justice meant accountability, then what did it mean when someone chose it willingly? Was punishment still required? For the first time since Daniel Cross's death, Elias could not answer that question. The internal struggle pushed him toward a decision he had avoided for weeks. He needed clarity. And clarity, in his mind, could only come from facing Mara directly. He sent her a message through an anonymous account, brief and calm, written without threats. A chance to explain before judgment. Mara read the message alone in her office late at night. She felt fear, but also a strange sense of relief. Running had never been her strength. Facing things was. She agreed to meet. The location was an abandoned courthouse on the edge of Grey Haven, closed years earlier due to structural damage. Its tall stone pillars still stood, weathered and cracked, a symbol of justice left behind by time. The choice felt intentional, almost poetic. On the night of the meeting, rain fell lightly, blurring the city lights. Mara arrived alone, her service weapon hidden beneath her coat. She stepped into the darkened courthouse, her footsteps echoing through empty halls. Elias was already there. He stood beneath the cracked dome of the main courtroom, hands visible, posture calm. He looked ordinary. No mask. No anger in his eyes. Just exhaustion. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "You don't look like a monster," Mara said finally. Elias gave a faint, humorless smile. "Neither do you." They sat across from each other on opposite benches, the space between them heavy with unspoken history. Elias spoke first, his voice controlled, almost gentle. He talked about the failures he had seen, the lives broken by legal technicalities, the belief that justice had become a performance rather than a truth. Mara listened without interrupting. When it was her turn, she did not defend herself. She spoke about mistakes, about how certainty could become blindness, about how the law was built by humans and therefore deeply flawed. "You're right about one thing," she said quietly. "The system fails people. I've seen it. I've been part of it." Elias's grip tightened around the gun hidden in his coat. This was not the response he had prepared for. "But killing doesn't fix it," Mara continued. "It just replaces one wrong with another. It silences truth instead of uncovering it." Elias stood, his emotions rising despite his efforts to contain them. He spoke of his sister, of her silence, of a courtroom that turned truth into strategy. His voice broke for the first time. "She trusted the law," he said, "and it abandoned her." Mara stood as well, closing the distance slightly but carefully. "I'm sorry," she said, and for once the words were not procedural. "What happened to her was wrong. But what you're doing doesn't bring her back. It just creates more families like yours." The silence that followed felt endless. Elias raised the gun. Mara did not move. She did not reach for her weapon. She met his eyes and held them, steady and unafraid. In that moment, Elias saw not a symbol of failure, but a person willing to face it. His hands began to shake. Outside, distant sirens grew louder. Someone had tracked a signal from his message. Time was collapsing around them. Elias lowered the gun slowly. His shoulders slumped, the weight of his beliefs crashing down on him all at once. He had wanted justice to be simple, clean, certain. Instead, it was messy, painful, and deeply human. "I don't know how to stop," he whispered. Mara took a step closer. "You already have." But even as he lowered the weapon, Elias knew something Mara did not. In his mind, balance still had to be restored. If he had taken lives in the name of justice, then he could not stand outside that judgment. Police sirens screamed just outside the courthouse. Elias stepped back, lifting the gun once more, this time turning it toward himself. Mara realized his intention too late. "No," she said, reaching out. "This isn't justice." Elias met her eyes one last time. "It's consistency." The shot echoed through the empty courtroom, louder than any that had come before. When officers rushed in, they found Mara kneeling beside Elias Ward's body, her hands shaking, her face streaked with tears she did not remember shedding. The justice killer was dead, but as Greyhaven would soon learn, the questions he left behind were far from answered. The abandoned courthouse did not return to silence after the gunshot. It held the sound, letting it echo and fade slowly, as if the building itself needed time to understand what had happened inside its broken walls. When officers rushed in, weapons raised, they found Detective Mara Klein kneeling on the cold floor beside Elias Ward's body. The man who had terrorized Greyhaven, the man the media called the Justice Killer, lay still, his face calm, almost relieved. For a long moment, no one spoke. Mara was escorted outside as medics confirmed what everyone already knew. Rain continued to fall, washing over the stone steps of the courthouse, mixing with flashing red and blue lights. Cameras appeared almost instantly, reporters shouting questions that blurred together into noise. Mara said nothing. Her eyes were fixed somewhere far beyond the crowd, still trapped in the final seconds before Elias pulled the trigger. By morning, the story consumed the nation. Headlines declared the Justice Killer dead. News channels replayed timelines, crime scene photos, and footage of Elias Ward taken from old records. His quiet life was dissected piece by piece. Former students were interviewed. Neighbors spoke of a man who kept to himself, who nodded politely but never lingered. Psychologists debated his mindset. Legal experts argued over whether his victims truly deserved punishment. Greyhaven became a symbol of a larger argument. Some people mourned the victims Elias had killed. Others spoke their names with bitterness, insisting they had escaped justice in life. Candlelight vigils were held for all involved, blending grief with confusion. Online debates grew harsher, more divided. The question echoed everywhere, whispered and shouted alike. Was Elias Ward a murderer? Or was he the result of a broken system? The police department released a statement confirming that Elias acted alone. His apartment was searched thoroughly. Inside, investigators found notebooks filled with detailed case notes, trial summaries, and personal reflections written in calm, careful handwriting. There were no signs of insanity in the traditional sense. No chaos. No fantasies of violence. Just belief. Each notebook ended the same way. Names crossed out. A scale drawn neatly in black ink. The word balance written again and again. For Detective Mara Klein, the days that followed felt unreal. She returned to work, but everything looked different. Hallways felt longer. Conversations felt heavier. Some officers treated her with quiet respect. Others avoided her entirely, unsure how to act around the woman who had nearly become the killer's final target. Mara did not blame them. She barely recognized herself. Sleep came rarely. When it did, it was filled with fragments of the courthouse. Elias's trembling hands. His voice breaking when he spoke of his sister. The sound of the gunshot, louder in her dreams than it had been in reality. What haunted her most was not fear, but understanding. She understood how Elias had reached his conclusions. She understood the pain that had shaped him. And that understanding terrified her, because it meant the line between justice and violence was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. Public pressure mounted quickly. Civil rights groups demanded investigations into every case Elias had referenced. Families of wrongfully convicted prisoners came forward, sharing stories that sounded painfully familiar. Politicians promised reform. Committees were formed. Speeches were made. For once, something changed. Several old cases were officially reopened, including the one involving Aaron Cole and the one tied to Thomas Reed. Evidence was re-examined. Witnesses were re-interviewed. In more than one case, misconduct and negligence were finally acknowledged. The truth emerged slowly, painfully. Some of the people Elias had killed were posthumously linked to real wrongdoing. Others existed in a gray space where guilt could never be proven fully, only suspected. The world did not become simpler with answers. It became more complicated. Mara testified before an internal review board about her past mistakes. She did not excuse them. She did not defend herself with procedure. She spoke honestly about certainty, about how confidence in the system could become a shield against doubt. Her career survived, but it was changed forever. Outside the department, the symbol of the scale became controversial. Some graffiti artists painted it on walls as a protest against corruption. Others erased it wherever it appeared, refusing to let a killer's mark become a movement. The image that once represented justice now carried fear, anger, and grief all at once. Greyhaven slowly returned to routine, but it was not the same city. People asked more questions. They paid closer attention to trials. Jurors spoke openly about doubt instead of rushing toward verdicts. It was not a revolution, but it was a shift. Elias Ward was buried quietly, with no public service. No one claimed his body except a distant relative who said little to the press. His sister's name appeared briefly in articles, her story finally told, though too late to matter to her. Mara visited the courthouse one last time before it was scheduled for demolition. The building stood empty, stripped of evidence tape and police lights. She walked into the main courtroom, where dust settled into the cracks of the floor. She stood where Elias had stood. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel everything she had been pushing down. Anger at the system. Sorrow for the victims. Sympathy for a man who believed murder was justice because justice had failed him first. She understood now that justice was not a fixed thing. It was fragile, shaped by human choices, strengthened or broken by those entrusted with it. When people lost faith in it completely, something dangerous filled the gap. Before leaving, Mara placed one of Elias's notebooks on the judge's bench. Not as tribute, not as forgiveness, but as a reminder. The pages were evidence of what happened when belief replaced accountability. Months later, the Justice Killer faded from headlines, but his shadow remained. Law schools discussed the case. Documentaries replayed it. Viewers argued in comment sections, still divided. Some said Elias Ward was wrong, no matter the system's failures. Others said the system had created him. Mara believed both were true. In her final report on the case, she wrote a single line that never made it to the media. It stayed buried in official records, unread by most, but it defined everything she had learned. Justice is not proven by punishment alone. It is proven by truth, responsibility, and the courage to face our failures before someone else decides to face them for us. Greyhaven moved forward, carrying that lesson quietly. And somewhere between fear and reform, between grief and understanding, the city learned that justice, once broken, can never be restored by blood. Only by honesty. Only by choice.